On a wider international basis, what sort of advice are you giving to the agencies that are trying to get from 0 to 1? And
I think understanding you don't have to recreate the wheel. This has been done in other areas, reaching out and partnering. We realize that you should be collaborating. You have to rely on others because the transactions and the activity takes place all over the world. The speed at which this happens is faster than anything we've seen before. So you're relying on getting information at the same speed from other parties. So these countries, these law enforcement community players that need to understand that you don't have to do it yourself. Reach out to us, reach out to me to find ways that you can emulate what we've done. We're happy to partner with those countries to provide training, to provide resources, to try to get access to tools, find ways to identify potential fraud that's occurring in your jurisdiction. Because that's really the hard part. It's like, okay, we have all the tools, we have dedicated resources. Now, how do we find the bad things going on so that we can attack that, stopping and boarding out bad actors?
hello and welcome to Seize and Desist. I'm Aidan Larkin, your host and the co-founder and CEO at Asset Reality. In this episode, recorded on the 26th of April, I'm joined by Jarod Koopman, Executive Director of Cyber and Forensic Services at IRS Criminal Investigation in the United States. Jarod joined the IRS right after college and spent his entire career there, rising through the ranks to become the first Director of Cybercrime. We hear about IRS-CI being the only federal law enforcement agency to focus 100% on financial fraud and learn that they've seized more crypto assets than any other agency in the world. Why is that? What is their secret sauce? What are they doing differently that other agencies can learn from? Or what success stories can they share that we can dissect, unpack, and try and implement that in various jurisdictions around the world? We also get his views on that actually seizing assets is one of the real deterrents for criminals in many cases, and that crypto isn't the criminal that it's often painted as. It facilitates criminal activity, and we have to remember that. We also discuss the Bitcoin fog case and the reliability of blockchain analytics data in court. And finally, the future of asset seizures. What will that look like? What's the role of Web3, gaming, and so many more topics? Jarod, thanks very much for joining us today. This has been a long time coming, and when we always knew we were launching Seize and Desist podcast, you were very much at the sort of top of my list to speak to, because I think that you've pretty much unrivaled experience in all things seizing assets, seizing crypto, and having to do that on an international stage. So welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. Yeah, always happy to join Asset Reality's activities and events somewhere in the world because you guys are top notch. So I appreciate it.
No, it's very kind of you. We had the pleasure, obviously, of talking about this a bit at the FATF panel on seized assets, and it sort of gave me a bit of an insight into your world. But I would like to start off by, that people will know from, I'm thinking non-US folks, will have heard of the FBI, will have heard of these agencies, but admittedly, even when I was in HMRC, I was aware of the different subsections within IRS, but I didn't understand. And then obviously when I started to get into this world, I realized, who the heck are these IRS-CI guys? And why and how and all of this? Can you give me the brief, the 101 on IRS-CI, and it's not just tax?
Yeah, absolutely. So IRS Criminal Investigation, we investigate violations of the Internal Revenue Code, but then all financial crimes, which is pretty interesting because our jurisdiction is very wide. We're the only federal law enforcement agency in the U.S. that completely dedicates 100% of our time to investigating financial fraud. So that can range from the traditional tax violations, which is certainly our bread and butter because we're the only agency that can do that. But that only makes up about 50% of our time globally. The other 50% starts to trigger into money laundering, terrorism financing, public corruption, identity theft, and then certainly cybercrime, which is what I've been focused on the last, almost decade.
And how does that work then in terms of like jurisdiction? How does it get decided? Is that a sort of tasking thing? If a victim or a corporation or Intel comes in and says there's this huge financial crime case, how does it end up with the likes of yourselves or an FBI or someone like that, or Secret Service?
Yeah, sure. So typically there's usually an IRS-CI agent on almost every major case. Our specialty, our niche is working financial fraud cases and tracing the money flow, whether it's digital or traditional finance. That's what the backbone of our agency's been built on for over 100 years now. But it's something that everybody brings their own skill sets to the table. Certainly FBI, large agency, HSI, DEA, they all have great capabilities. Ours is focused on, the financial trail and that money component. I always give the example of a good drug case, right? So we don't do drugs. We certainly help in those cases, but DEA brings their expertise in those organized crime and drug investigations. And then we support those cases and work alongside them by tracing the money flow and helping with that financial piece. So that's kind of where everything flows in. And to be honest with you, there's more crime than there is, agents to work. So
plenty to go around.
We certainly don't have an ego here that, we need to be taking cases. It's something that we try to collaborate with our federal partners to really just work these cases as effectively as possible.
I am going to push the ego bit because, how and why, what is the secret sauce? Why is it that, and I don't know if you can say, I know there's lots of cases in the public domain, but by all means, how has the IRS-CI become this world lead? You guys seem to be just posting figures that are exceptionally beyond everybody collectively combined. I know you're going to be very diplomatic. I get that there's lots of multi-agencies involved. I get the fact there's lots of people on the ticket for a lot of these things, but clearly a lot of these are IRS-CI driven cases. What do you think has been those factors? And where I'm getting to in all of this is how other agencies can try and emulate this sort of globally. But what for you stands out in the decades you've been involved as the reason that what are you doing right that you think gets you these huge cases?
We kind of always break it down into three buckets: people, technology, and relationship or capacity building. Our people, first and foremost, starting back in 2013, 14, we were engaged in this space with a full group, two full groups really around that time. And they were working the first cases of this kind. You were talking about digital currency in its truest form with Liberty Reserve, to then Silk Road, to then BTC, and some of those foundational cases. Those cases set the precedent for it, and I credit it to our agents. Our agents at that time were, because we were financially driven and working those financial fraud cases, they were all in. They understood the complexity, the importance, and the future leaning aspect of crypto and digital assets at that time. They dove all in. We kind of gave them the resources and they were off and running. And this is prior to blockchain analytic tools, prior to the structure and support that exists today of really a wider audience that understands the complexities of the technology. So they really did that as a homegrown grassroots revival that they just spread that. And it's taken off in our agency as something that we're going to claim to be the best financial investigators. It has to include crypto and digital assets. So they've all bought into that.
You've got to do the difficult stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And then to add to that is technology. We invest in understanding the tech, being creative, being innovative, whether that's pushing to areas that most law enforcement agencies aren't even looking at yet. Gaming, Web3 and the metaverse, things like that we as law enforcement usually wait until it's a problem right in front of us versus being a little bit proactive and taking those steps to gain knowledge in that area. And then lastly, capacity building. We've partnered very closely with industry leaders, academia, to really leverage what they're providing. We understand we're not going to be able to do this on our own. We all are trying to learn the space, stay on top of the space, and that becomes very hard when limited resources, personnel, and you're trying to do 1,000 other cases that are active. So, it's one of those things we realize that it takes a village to kind of attack this space to stop the criminal activity.
So would you say it's fair to say then you're sort of seeing the ROI because you were brave enough? Because I can imagine from my own limited time in a law enforcement setting that sometimes it's just hard to get cases adopted and taken on. And I can only imagine what those conversations must have been like, 10 years ago now, to be saying, oh yeah, we're going to do this thing with the blockchain and who's that and what's this and there's no tools and we're going to do that. Would you mind giving me the simple version in the sense of, because I don't think that many people, unless they've read the books, everyone's heard about the Silk Road, everyone's seen the movie on Netflix and they've seen those things, but just to give how that actually originated in IRS-CI, because some of your guys, the Silk Road story doesn't exist without IRS-CI.
Yeah, and a lot of those cases, especially the early ones, it was the challenge of not only internally, because we had a support from our culture and our group and everybody else, but it was the next level, right? It was making leadership understanding what we're trying to do here. It was convincing the U.S. attorneys and Department of Justice of pursuing these cases and the impact that they had. I think we had some really great forward-leaning attorneys as well. You had some pioneers in the space that were driving these cases and really supporting what we were trying to pitch. And without that, it wouldn't have gone anywhere. It required kind of this holistic government approach to kind of take down these criminals. And yeah, it was definitely a challenge. I used to always say we're trying to build a castle out of toothpicks, because we very little resources, Nobody was giving us tons of funding, so we were trying to partner with analytic firms at very early startup stages, trying to just figure out how we could bring justice to these cases.
It is, and we often talk about the fact that they're not just crypto cases. I mean, so many people get sort of dragged into looking at these, whereas I'm right in saying one of the key things in Silk Road was the overall, just the OSINT around the case. It's like if you're a country that doesn't have all of the analytic tools, doesn't have all of the resources, it doesn't mean you can't be involved in these big sort of crypto cases or seizure opportunities or just working the case, because a lot of the times there will be lots of, I think he famously signed a blog post like ross.ulbricht@gmail.com.
Yeah, that's true. And I think you're hitting on a good point, because I mean, a lot of those cases were done before we had all of these, high-tech tools and monitoring, tracing capacities. What it's done, though, is just made it easier. It's made it more efficient. What used to take us so much longer to actually go through transactional details by hand, doing like public blockchain research, the block explorer, and going through every tracing component now is done at the fingertips of entering a wallet address, and boom, these analytic tools have kind of mapped out all the transactions through multiple hops. All of that's changed drastically, but it is a good point that you could still do all of this without the large outlay of funding to big tools, personnel, and resources. But it does take work. You got to be creative, and that's what speaks volumes to the personnel. There are very great investigators that are on our cyber teams that they get creative. They use open source tools, open source intel to really find those needles in the haystack.
And that sort of ties in quite well with the fact that you'd mentioned earlier on about the taking a village approach. It is that combination of having the willing, and because a lot of these cases, they would never see the light of day if you don't have people internally interested in doing it. And we all have experienced times when we can't get cases adopted, and you've got people sort of pushing back on a wider international basis. What sort of advice are you giving to the agencies that are trying to get from 0 to 1 and beyond? Maybe it's not even a tooling and a resourcing thing. What sort of advice are you trying to get people to? Is it just a bit of entrepreneurialism and they have to pitch to their bosses to go and allow these cases? How do you think they could do better?
I think understanding you don't have to recreate the wheel. This has been done in other areas. It's kind of reaching out and partnering. That's that capacity building concept. We realize that you should be collaborating. We've done it in other areas, but one of the first times in my career, this has really broken down a lot of barriers that existed between collaboration internally, externally, internationally. You have to rely on others because the transactions and the activity takes place all over the world. The speed at which this happens is faster than anything we've seen before. So you're reliant on getting information at the same speed from other parties. So these countries, these law enforcement community players that need to understand that you don't have to do it yourself. Reach out to us. Reach out to me to find ways that you can emulate what we've done. We're happy to partner with those countries to provide training, to provide resources, to try to get access to tools, and to also find ways to identify potential fraud that's occurring in your jurisdiction. Because that's really the hard part. It's like, okay, we have all the tools, we have dedicated resources. Now, how do we find the bad things going on so that we can attack that and show that ROI in terms of enforcement, in terms of seizure, in terms of stopping and boarding out the bad actors?
Do you think that the new FATF or the new standards that we're expecting to see coming down the line now for the next 3 to 4 years, part of me tries to be a realist about it, that of course it's going to be a good thing, but just how effective can it really be? Some of the biggest critics of FATF standards currently are former FATF staff, saying that the entire world right now, there still isn't a single country that is compliant with all of the standards. So is it a case of the standards are wrong or ineffective, or is it a case of one person even posed that maybe FATF needs oversight to check how FATF are checking people? Well, what are your thoughts on the future direction of travel with FATF's new push on asset recovery? Is it a good thing? Do you think it's going to force people into action, or maybe should we sort of temper expectations a bit?
Yeah, I think a combination of both. Anytime you have a regulatory aspect put in place, some type of potential enforcement in that front, guide rails that are set, you have more compliance. I mean, that's kind of known. So if the object is to have better compliance to stop potential criminal activity, that's going to help. But I think from a realistic standpoint, yeah, certainly you're never going to have full compliance. That's almost never going to happen. And you can't regulate your way out of that. It's always going to have those actors. You're always going to have personnel capacity issues that folks just can't comply or don't comply intentfully or willfully. And that's where we come in. So if you have guide rails set up and countries, service providers, entities are not complying willfully, those are the ones we're going to focus on, right? Because now there's a regime in place, there's standards that are set across the globe, and those that don't want to comply with it will draw the attention of all the law enforcement community across the world to basically stop them. So it's really putting that small group that hopefully is small into a corner and trying to go after them, that we can have that higher sense of compliance.
Yeah, you almost need to draw the battle lines first to then figure out who's outside or the guide rails. Speaking of drawing attention, and I appreciate some of these cases you may or may not be able to comment on, so just tell us, we'll skip on. I was reading a lot of press over the last couple of days, and in a spectacular drawing attention to oneself and then getting the wrath of the global law enforcement was Samurai Wallet, which for those that don't know, whether it was tongue-in-cheek or not, because I've saw both sides now, I'm starting to see on LinkedIn some people saying, oh, they were just having some fun when they were mocking sanctions and promoting circumventing sanctions by welcoming the Russian oligarchs to use their tools and services, and then pretty much being quite disrespectful about Europol. I'll not repeat the phrase, but let's just say they weren't particularly afraid of Europol coming after them. What do you think this sort of says for the future of mixers? Because I know it's such a big, and I'd love to hear your own thoughts to the extent that you can share about this balance between the right and the genuine need for privacy versus those like deliberate bad actors. I'd love to hear your thoughts on mixers, and obviously whatever you can say on Samurai Wallet.
Yeah, absolutely. So some great points, because I think you're hitting on exactly the topic of this technology in general, right? It's the balance of privacy to allowing bad actors a platform to take advantage of it. And that's really going to be the focus. This case underscored it. It was one of those very high-profile, long-standing obfuscation wallet service that provided kind of everything and anything to those that wanted to use it. And I think that's the line, is that I support privacy in terms of your financial transacting, but not at the cost when it potentially bring about, serious illegal activities. I mean, we're talking about child exploitation, terrorism financing. I mean, if you're allowing that type of stuff to flow through your platforms, you're going to have some major issues. So I think from a mixer tumbling service, that area right now is drawing a ton of scrutiny because there isn't a lot of oversight in terms of, that monitoring to understand the source of funds. If they can build in capabilities, I think that privacy would still remain a viable solution to proceed, but without deterring criminal actors of using the platform, that's always going to remain a high priority for law enforcement, for regulators, because you can't allow that. You're opening it up to kind of Wild West, what happens and what transacts on your tool. Specific to the Samurai Wallet and the owners, I mean, you're talking about $2 billion in unlawful transactions over time. $2 billion.
No, it's not two kids in a basement.
Yeah, right. So you're talking about some significant funding that the problem is you don't know what that's being used for. It could range from all those kind of criminal activities I talked about to just somebody wanting to use privacy to transact. And without knowing that, delineating between the two, that's very tough. But over $100 million, laundered. So that's specifically identifiable to criminal activity. So you're talking about really significant amounts there that we have to be cognizant of. This was a big issue. I mean, we just came off of the Bitcoin fog investigation, which had some really great...
Yeah, that was my next question.
Yeah, that was another great example of a wide open platform that was allowing, or service that was allowing illegal activity and actually promoting the use of their service on darknet marketplaces, similar to Helix. I mean, the list goes on and on. You see this repeated pattern of...
Because it's profitable?
Yeah. If they're making money, we don't care, right? And to the extent that you proactively are allowing illegal activity that is illegal to basically use your platform and your service to circumvent, that's the problem. That's the line in the sand that we have to control.
So that's really useful. One of the themes of this podcast is around keeping it simple. And one of my favorite speakers, Simon Sinek, always talks about being the idiot and asking the questions that many people don't want to ask. And you and I have seen this on panel sessions where there are people who won't put their hand up, but afterwards they'll come and say, look, this isn't my lane. I don't get a lot of this stuff. In the same way, I don't understand digital forensics or programming or coding. So can you give for those that don't know, the 101 on mixers and tumblers, and you made a really important point there, and I want to head on this illicit figure, the very contentious blockchain sort of what's illicit statistic. But you'd mentioned that they know it's illegal. How do they know it's illegal? And how does a mixer work in general?
Well, first, mixer and tumbling services operate by bringing in cryptocurrency and bringing it into usually a reserve that they have or clean funds that they have in the same crypto and doing an exchange. And on the back end, they're sending that fund back to the individual where it's now not.
So who owns the stuff that it's getting mixed or exchanged with?
The owners of that service. So it could be a wallet provider like Samurai Wallet, could be an actual service like Helix or Bitcoin Fog where they're only set up to mix the funds. In Samurai Wallet, a little bit different. They control the wallet, which then provided these services within the wallet. I think they called it, they have a Whirlpool and a Ricochet. Those were the two services that could basically mix the funds and then kick out on the back end clean funds, which aren't tied to your original source. That transaction is basically laundering on the blockchain. That's all it is. I mean, you're literally mixing it up to then kick out clean digital assets or crypto on the back end.
What are some of the legitimate reasons that you've heard why people would do it? Because I'm imagining these aren't cheap in terms of transaction fees and incredibly risky that they could just not give you the money back or get hacked.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's definitely a trust factor there. And these companies exist because they've probably been in business for 7-10 years, operating on darknet marketplaces, building credibility. But yeah, the fees they can range from, I think, like 2.5% in Helix to up to 10%.
And for those that don't know, that's not market, given that most people are paying like point something of a percent at a well-known regulated exchange.
Yeah, and as far as legitimacy, I mean, other than privacy and not wanting to share, your kind of transactional information and history, which there's reasons for that. You could have ex-business partners, ex-spouses. You could have a financial reason for not wanting your information publicly known. I've also heard of whistleblowers, trying to transact to be able to not have that information shared to protect their identity, and things like that.
The same with I've heard of political donations and funding war, but these are exceptional outlier.
Exactly.
I often think of the example, it's like if I'm driving down the motorway, the freeway, and I have a wife that's in labour or a parent that's having a heart attack and I have to break the speed limit, that's the one time that the judge might say, do you know what, on this occasion, I'm not going to, or the prosecutors aren't going to take a case. Has it been proven before, or have you seen even anecdotally or in the public domain? Are they using like transaction monitoring tools in the sense of anyone just comes in and sends in the transaction? Or is it allocation of the fact that the attribution on what you're saying, they know it's illicit? It's because it's on a darknet website is where they're accessing and advertising their services.
Yeah, so I think the cases that we pursue, there's completely nothing in place. I mean, they are wide open to allow this. Now, they are in environments like darknet marketplaces for that reason. And, it just adds to the intent of the owners in the service to just allow anything to come through it. I mean, they
just don't have transaction monitoring at all.
No, not at all. They are blatantly open about, we will open this up. I mean, they message this on darknet forums and on boards that you have illegal income. This is the way to do it and use our service because they want to make money. And that's kind of what it comes down to.
It is crazy. And I suppose when people then make the comparison, I mean, you don't have to be a crypto expert to understand. If I said to you, I have 100,000 in US dollars and I want to change those to British pounds, you wouldn't expect there to be a single institution in the world that wouldn't ask to see your identity information or ask to see something. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's this balance, but I hate to quote Gary Gensler, but I do agree hypothetically that all industries have to have guide rails, because you have seen and I have seen in a limited version that if you leave these gaps, it'll get exploited, and it won't be the person running for their life. It'll be the person who's engaged in child exploitation cases. It's the welcome to videos of the world. It's the people that are trying to hide the proceeds of their ill-gotten gains to then on-ramp into the legitimate economy. And on that point, cases like welcome to video, I think that was a great reminder of one such an important case, but that these just aren't crypto cases, just a digital asset being used as a means of payment. But could you give us a bit of just a reminder for those that don't know?
Yeah, sure. Case? So probably one of the most impactful cases in CI history, and something that highlighted that the exact point that you're making is that, the realization that crypto is used as a means of the facilitation of this. It's not that crypto is illegal. It's not that the crypto itself is the bad aspect. It's that these criminals use it as the medium of exchange. And in Welcome to Video, you have a darknet marketplace that was 100% focused on child exploitation and 100% dealing in cryptocurrency as their means of transacting. They were selling and buying and posting child exploitation material, CSAM material for global consumption. And it was the largest darknet marketplace involving this activity. I think at the time, still, ICMEC and NCMEC, the National Centers for Exploited Missing Children, said it was the largest consolidation of videos and material in history, and new materials and videos, which is astronomical. But case that CI worked solely, and then with some of our foreign partners, brought in others to assist just based on the magnitude. We ended up seizing a significant amount of money in that case, I think around $1 million, but then also seizing the servers of all that material, taking down the admins and the vendors associated, and then went after all of the individuals that are using that platform globally. So we partnered with our global law enforcement partners, and I think last time I looked, it was up over probably approaching 400 arrests worldwide, and just taking down some of these criminals.
So you're able to get the actual offences there, but obviously the financial fraud element from IRS-CI is those that are operating the service and doing so for a profit as
absolutely.
well.
Yeah, so those that are benefiting, those that are taking advantage of it, but then also the users. I mean, this is a heinous crime, one that, we can't allow to continue and anywhere. So it's one of those things that we attack from all ends. We try to take down the admins, shut down the server, but then you can't forget all these people that are conducting.
And you've all that data.
Yeah, and all that data, they're going to bounce somewhere else, and use a different platform when it pops up. So it's trying to really have a global, wider impact.
Like you say, it is something that the team should be genuinely proud of, because those cases, it is impossible to measure the impact on those cases, but it's very clear the positive impact it has by taking one down. But I sadly believe that it's the whack-a-mole, and that's the rat race. That's the job that you've signed up for.
Bringing that back to the seizure component, if we don't take down these criminals and strip them of those proceeds and those ill-gotten gains, all you're doing is lopping off the head of the snake and another one grows, right? They will move to another platform, or those criminals will see it as a cost of doing business. Okay, I'll get arrested, I'll do my time, and I come out and I'm a millionaire, right? So we have to understand the economy at play and why they do this. Going back to the mixers and tumblers, it's to make money. And if we're not stopping them from making money, they will continue, and they will continue to profit and be lucrative in their business op.
It's something we discussed at length. If you remember on the FATF panel, this was the importance that asset seizure plays. And in the US, that's obviously been a very hot topic around civil forfeiture, non-conviction based forfeiture. You've just sort of alluded to it, but perhaps just to give it its own section to dive into. As someone who's been a practitioner in this front for so long and involved in such a broad range of cases, I've certainly seen money laundering cases and criminal investigation cases and prosecutions that the asset seizure part wasn't really a key part. But just give us your thoughts on just the role of asset seizure. What's the 4Ds, sort of denying, depriving, sort of dismantling and deterring, and the impact that actually has. You'd alluded to the cost of doing business a little bit. Just how important is asset seizure in the overall sort of fight against crime?
Yeah, this is it's huge to our agency, but also to all law enforcement, and it should be a priority. And I think it gets lost sometimes on the folks that are working these cases, that they're super focused on holding somebody accountable, finding the criminals and locking them up and getting that big splash, right? And that's great. It is a big component of it, but you have to kind of continue to follow through on that, because to that point, that if you just do that, they're able to come out and have millions of dollars sitting in some account or assets all over the world. You had no deterrent effect. They will continue to operate. They will continue to show that criminal activity pays. From our standpoint, again, going back to our job, financial investigators, we kind of run that gamut of following through the financial trail all the way to the end. We want to know where that money was spent, housed, what assets were purchased, because that's all going back to that criminal activity. So a real efficient investigation should go that entire depth and then seize, those funds. And that is always a priority on our mind from day one. Was we know we have a large criminal enterprise. Can we take them down, and can we seize everything they profited from that? Because that's going to be the real impact. That's going to be the real deterrent effect. We've had cases where the criminal themselves are crying or telling us that they don't mind going to jail, but they just didn't want all of their assets seized, because that's their win.
Take me, not the speedboat.
Yeah, that's right. Right.
It is. It's fascinating because I remember seizing assets in the UK, and you would see, the neighbours peeking out the window, and you can see the sort of the sense of satisfaction that the same sort of the kingpin, the Mr. Big, that's lived in the mansion with the speedboats and the jet skis and the big vehicles and the holiday homes and no legitimate income, and that's the bit that gets the attention. That's the bit. I think if you think of it like a startup, you need to deprive them of their capital. Otherwise, it's just as you say, someone else takes over. They're reinvested, the cost of doing business isn't high. What is the future of this? You'd alluded to gamify, for example. I mean, you guys have been very good at future gazing and making a bet in 2014. We need to look at this more. I appreciate we can never be certain. But what do you think like an average IRS-CI portfolio could look like in 5 years, 10 years time? What do you think the seizure landscape, like what are we going to be going after? Are we going to be in our Oculus headsets chasing people around the metaverse? Or actually seizing digital tokens that could be everyone right now with a meme coin? These are the future potential millionaires in another 5 or 10 years.
That's a great point, and it's funny because I mentioned that almost the same verbiage on other things, and you'll get a little chuckle out of people about the Oculus wearing agents, but we are dead serious. We are very focused on the future of where the space is going. And again, it might not be mass scale where you have all of society using these platforms, but that's not who we're after, right? That's why the guide rails will be in place from a regulatory standpoint to take care of all of those, the society as a whole.
You're going after the outliers. That's exactly it. They're not the normal cases.
That's right. And we'll still have cases that come from the formal regulatory space because criminals will be criminals. They'll try to do something and it will get caught. But the outliers are going to be those ones on gaming industries and, the metaverse, setting up digital stores and digital footprints to be able to kind of operate in more of that DeFi space. And we do see that as kind of the next wave. We are focused on that area. It's something that we think is potential for exploitation because there isn't a lot of understanding, a lot of guide rails, a lot of monitoring, and it's open to a lot of individuals being involved that could have ill intent. From a gaming perspective, I think it also brings in a lot of things we talked about. Nowadays, you have criminals that are talking with smaller children on these gaming platforms. So you're opening the potential up for child exploitation. You have criminal enterprises in different countries for sanctions activities, for terrorism financing. You have secure chat channels. You have the ability to hop between games using different tokens in a seamless manner. It is really creating an environment that is tough for law enforcement and others to monitor and to really enforce. So we are focused on making this a mission for us to make sure that doesn't become the next area that is exploited.
And I think exploited is a great point to anchor that on because it is the area that always raises a bit of a chuckle with people and they think it'll never be that thing. And I know that if I was a criminal, well, that's exactly the place I'm going to exploit because I know it doesn't have the attention that it deserves. And I think it's only when, and that's why you guys deserve a lot of credit, it's only when you jump into it and you get your eyes opened and you realize, how can you investigate a criminal who uses a particular system if you don't understand that system? I remember someone giving us the example around new methodologies for sort of smuggling drugs. Well, no, the cartels used to use planes and then they used to spot the planes. And if you'd have said to someone 30 or 40 years ago, oh no, they'll build mini submarines and be moving the stuff around with mini submarines. But it took some people with sort of naval and maritime experience to start tracking the invoices of the spend and go down the rabbit hole of going, why are they buying this sort of equipment? It's always the absurd stuff, and it's only absurd until someone debunks it and demystifies it. Do you think that the methodology still stays the same though? I was just talking at a conference yesterday about the fact that behind all of this complexity, whether it's a DAO or it's a DeFi platform of some description, or it's a token, or it's some new metaverse sort of that is a cover for a scam. In these criminal cases, there's still a person. Until we have sort of sentient AI committing fraud, there's always a person or a gang or a thing underneath. How do you think about the next batch of recruits coming through? How do you stay resilient and make sure as people are retiring, people are getting jobs in the private sector and moving on? How do you keep people sort of enthused into that so that you don't just have this class of 2024 mentality? We had a bunch of rock stars, but you guys are repeating success. How do you keep that formula up of new people coming in as enthusiastic in spite of you always having a bit of an Everest in front of you of fighting against very well funded criminals.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, we certainly have challenges in government. We're competing with private sector, but we don't look at that as a detriment. I think we find those folks that have a drive to really have more impact, right? To have that impact, that for love of country, for love of the right thing, they have a little bit different drive, which makes them really dangerous, right? It makes them really good at their job because they're driven by something much more just money. And when we have that, we have folks that are really focused on pushing the space, becoming good at their craft. And we've repeatedly tried to tap into those folks, whether it's recruiting at different venues, whether it's identifying those people that really have an interest in the space for the right reason, and then giving them the tools, setting them up for success. You can't just bring them on and be like, hey, have at it. It's one of those things where you have to...
You're making a contract with them. No, come in here with enthusiasm. We will give you the cases and give you the tools.
Yeah, we're not looking for someone that knows everything about the space. That's almost impossible. It's you're interested in the space. Maybe you have a background in it, but you have that mindset, that growth mindset that you want to come in and we're going to feed you tools, the resources, capabilities, and then let your innovation, your imagination kind of run to figure out where we should be focused. At the same time, we have our priorities on what we want to attack. And then building a culture, I think, internally where these great cases are continuing to develop, continuing to be worked. There's almost like this internal sense of pride and competition amongst our group that, hey, who's going to work the next, $3 billion seizure? Who's going to work the next case that is the highlight of the year? And then partnering certainly with private sector to get the trainings in these really unique areas, right? We try to reach out and find those folks that have expertise in metaverse, in DeFi protocols, in smart contract, and say, hey, we want to tap into your knowledge. Teach us, because we need to know.
Well, I think probably the industry will tell you most people are afraid to say no to you because you're a black belt.
Yeah, my best. I mean, I've trained a couple times with Hoist Gracie, in different aspects.
Wow.
Yeah, I had him sign at the time, I think I was a blue or purple belt. I had him sign my belt. Actually, I had him sign UFC 1 on VHS. I have the original VHS.
Nice.
Yeah, I know. I was like, and it was funny when I was doing it, I had a couple younger students behind me that were asking me what it was. They're like, what is that? And I'm like,
it's a large thing of plastic.
Yeah, they're like, what do you do with it? And I'm like, you play it in a VHS. They had never seen a VHS. I was like,
I used to have that as a desktop like screensaver. It's a Lest We Forget, and it's a picture of a VHS, a cassette tape, and a 3.5-inch floppy disk.
Yeah.
All holding their hand, all somnol. It's like, that's true. People just look at it and go,
yeah.
The change of digital forensics. That's more. How do you think your sort of extracurricular activities have helped your mindset? Because we're always talking about how to build resilient asset recovery teams and we're trying to tackle this 1%. It's not easy. You've summarized it very well that you need willing people. You need that from a leadership standpoint for your counterparts around the world and people that are trying to build similar teams. Could you share some of your experiences on how that's... So I'm sure you've had some long hours and sort of early days where you're sort of thinking, how do you tap in to have the energy to still be so enthusiastic for this fight?
Yeah, I think part of it's a personal, that growth mindset, going back to, I talk about this a lot, and it's something that you just have to have that drive internally to continue to grow. I think for me, I just found a passion in that area. It challenges both my mind and physically to a point where you're never going to learn everything in that space. You're always going to have somebody better than you. And that is the hard part to comprehend, but then it's what feeds your motivation to continue. And, it's pretty cool. I just found out another agent in CI is also a black belt, which makes our 4th in CI across the country. So we're developing this little...
Wow. So this is the secret sauce. If you're building a team...
It might be. But it's a uniqueness that I think we get a lot of folks drawn to that sport that have very unique mindsets. They are driven by this like intellectual... And it's funny that I say that because it's more about the mindset versus the physicality. The mindset is one that people come in and they're thirsty for knowledge. They want to expand their capabilities. But it's also knowing that there's never an end in sight. I've been training 20 plus years, and it's like you will continue to grow the rest of your life and never have complete understanding of the space. And that's kind of what the interesting aspect is. And I equate it to digital assets.
It's like education and academia. Like you're never going to go, I'm done now. I've learned everything in the world.
Yeah, right. I know everything. I'm good.
I have all the knowledge. So it goes back to my sort of Simon Sinek reference. His book, sort of Start With Why, is one of my favorite books. And he talks about having that, to inspire people along on a challenge. You need to have a North Star. And he says it's called a North Star for a reason. It's not because of the direction, it's because of the distance. You're never going to reach it. He says for those people that are truly committed to something, your target needs to almost be unreachable, or almost unreachable in your lifetime. We are never going to see a day in our lifetime that we solve 100% of the asset recovery cases, lock up all the criminals and seize all the assets. But if we know that doing it as part of our lifetime, we move the needle in the right direction and just map out a little bit more of the playbook for the next wave. I think attracting people to that sort of mission is a particular type of person that wants that. And I think that obviously Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as well, like resilience. If you're in the middle of an arm bar and sort of that you're reflecting on things, that must be quite similar to some of the challenges you faces in these cases.
Yeah, and creativity.
Chess match.
You hit walls. Yeah, you hit walls, right? That you're stuck. You're in a bad position. You're in somewhere that doesn't feel like there's any out. And just like our cases, you find ways to, where can I go? Where can we try to make attribution? How can we get creative to use the tools we have or the information available to really uncover these criminals? So yeah, it's kind of that interesting similarity.
So basically the takeaway point, the too long don't read, is basically just go and hire black belts only for your team.
That's right.
For those that can't hire those, what do you think the future looks like with elections aside? There has been this battle raging. We spoke to Amanda Wick just a couple of weeks ago and talked about that in the US in particular, non-conviction based forfeiture is a very, very hot topic because of alleged abuses of process. Now, as a big asset recovery advocate, I would not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And the example I'd given to Amanda was that for the terrible times that innocent people have been locked up or incarcerated, we don't say you shouldn't lock anybody up anymore. For those that don't know, some of IRS-CI's biggest seizures and some of the biggest crypto cases in the world were actually civil forfeiture was the mechanism for which you actually took those assets. Could you talk a bit about IRS-CI and sort of civil forfeitures being useful for you guys?
Yeah, absolutely. So IRS has been at the forefront of this for many years. It's in our jurisdiction of this, asset forfeiture recovery. So we've used, going back to traditional finance and traditional crime cases, I mean, civil forfeiture, criminal forfeiture, they're always a component of what we can use to seize funds anytime it's involved in any illegal activity. Problem is that sometimes you get program areas that are focused on, a civil aspect that could be, one that is contemplated as, whether it's really criminal in nature or whether it should be subject to civil forfeiture. And I think the idea is making those adjustments quickly, understanding that if that is an area that shouldn't be focused on or that the government as a whole wants to remove, I think to your piece, you don't throw out all of them. You need to then shift gears to focusing on the areas that we need to be. And over the years, I mean, since 2020, we've seized about 11.5 billion in cryptocurrency. And, those cases primarily are tied to investigations, criminal investigations. So we're working in criminal investigations. Sometimes the forfeiture is done as either proceeds of that crime, as evidence of the fraud, but other times it can bring in, the civil component, civil seizure aspects to be able to really get our hands on those funds. With that comes a big responsibility, right? Because we have to do those seizures properly. We have to understand the impact that that's causing because they can be case precedent setting. They can really laying the groundwork for what follows. And that's a challenge. I mean, we tend to really focus efforts on criminal seizures in our work, sometimes depending on when that information is available, the status of the criminal case at the time, where we are in actually making attribution and holding somebody accountable. That's not always feasible. So we have to use the means that we have available. And if it's the wrong thing to do, we will also own that and make sure that we, rectify it, giving funds back to the individual, stopping those type of program areas. It does happen and that changes with the legal landscape, but we always try to do the right thing for the right reasons.
Again, it's the fascinating thread here that we're getting from a BJJ point of view. It's the agility. Yeah. It's being able to actually say that particular way isn't working that direction of travel. And obviously, for those that don't know or need reminded, IRS probably has the most famous use of criminal to civil case in history with Al Capone.
Yeah.
Team I used to work in, the criminal taxes unit, we famously, our tagline to like ministers or when the organization was being set up in HMRC was the Al Capone effect. If you can't get them on criminal, get them on civil. If the alleged drug dealer also claims his profits are from his car wash, let's prosecute him for not declaring his business and paying his tax. So I love that. And I think everything I've heard from you today is just about going in sort of bravely into these new cases, dealing with the facts that are in front of you, being agile and nimble in sort of decision making, but recruiting the right people with the right mindset allows you to sort of future proof in terms of recruitment and hiring as well, and having that team. The last thing I just wanted to ask you, because it's so relevant, and I think a lot of people still don't understand the significance of the Bitcoin fog and that judgment. Yeah. A lot of mudslinging in the press. There was a lot of talk about what this meant for blockchain analytics as a whole. I think a lot of people don't understand necessarily the Dober test and what those things mean. From your point of view, how important is that particular decision? What effect should that have going forward, in your opinion?
It's a great segue. So yeah, very interesting case. So for those not familiar, the defense raised arguments that blockchain analytics, specifically in that case, was associated with the Chainalysis reactor platform, and some of the information and analytics completed in that, along with the expert testimony, was basically should not be included. That I think they called the blockchain analytics as junk science. This is something that can't be relied on. Good thing for us is that based on that decision, they ruled in favor of the government against the defense, stating that blockchain analytics is a valid, scientific, proven method for the analytic portion of tracing those funds. And we've been very judicious in the way that we attack that, in terms of making sure that we go through and understand attribution, that we understand data, that we understand heuristic modeling and how they're actually coming up with those attributions, because that's really what's driving the information behind it. And in terms of, for us specific, we don't hone in on one tool. We use all of the tools. They all have great attribution data. They all have great capabilities, and we understand that we want to leverage that as a whole from industry, and then mix that with the other data that we can find throughout our investigative efforts through open source intelligence. So what it has done is it's kind of laid that groundwork that blockchain analytics is here to stay. Monitoring transactions is a must do in these type of cases if you're going to show good faith that your business, your entity, your service provider, your wallet, whatever, is actually stopping any known illegal activity from.
And I guess that is a good point for us to sort of wrap up on, is that all of this technology, all of these things that we have, there's kind of no reason why companies, if they wanted to try and develop some sort of privacy enhancing solution, just make it compliant with the laws of the jurisdiction, and don't sort of poke the bear. Jarod, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate how busy you are and for sort of helping debunk a lot of these things. I think now we'll probably see a large rise in sign-ups to gyms as police chiefs all around the world will start recruiting black belts to tackle crypto and asset recovery.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you very much for having me, and always great talking with you, Aidan.
Thanks again. I'm very grateful to Jarod for sharing his time and insights with us. And I would encourage you to follow IRS Criminal Investigation on LinkedIn. They've truly been at the cutting edge of best practices in asset recovery, especially involving digital assets, for some time now. And there's a lot of great insights and regular cases that they share. So that's definitely one you don't want to miss out on following. If you've enjoyed today's conversation, please like and subscribe to Seize and Desist podcast on whatever platform you choose to listen to. And also leave a comment and any suggestions for future topics you would like us to discuss or guests that you would like to see on the show. Next time, I'm joined by David Carlisle, Vice President of Policy and Regulatory Affairs at Elliptic and the author of the book, The Crypto Launderers. We discuss cryptocurrency policy, the intersection of crime, technology, and finance, as well as his incredibly interesting and informative book. It's a walk through the use of crypto in money laundering with a phenomenal timetable of all of the exciting cases and insights into them. A must read for anybody in this sector. Until next time, and as always, thank you for listening.
Our podcasts are for informational purposes only. They are not intended to provide legal, tax, financial, and/or investment advice. Listeners must consult their own advisors before making any decisions on the topics being discussed.